Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a story that's just become considerably more serious because a couple of days ago we were talking about the extraordinary sight of a United States Air Force C-17 military transport aircraft landing in Moscow. Nobody appeared to know why it was there. Then we discovered that the director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, had secretly flown to Russia for meetings with Russian intelligence officials. But now we know why. And if the latest reports are correct, this is potentially a very important development because it's being reported that the United States has obtained intelligence suggesting Russia could attempt to test NATO. And the concerns were apparently serious enough that America sent the director of the CIA personally into Moscow to deliver a very simple warning: do not attack NATO. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that America believes thousands of Russian tanks are about to roll across the border into Poland or Estonia tomorrow morning. That's not what's being reported, not yet. What US intelligence is apparently concerned about is something much more subtle: a limited attack, a cyber attack, a hybrid operation, some sort of incursion, something that Russia could potentially use to test NATO, and more importantly, test whether NATO members would actually honour Article 5 and come to each other's defence. And that raises one absolutely fascinating question. What does America know? Because CIA directors do not routinely get on US military aircraft, fly secretly into Moscow and deliver warnings to Russian intelligence officials unless somebody somewhere is concerned about something. So in this video, I want to look at what's been reported, exactly what the United States appears to be worried about, why Russia might potentially want to test NATO, why the Baltic states are particularly important, and why what happened this week has some very uncomfortable similarities with another CIA director's trip to Moscow back in 2021, because that visit also involved a warning, and we all know what happened next. Now, before we get into the details, can I ask anybody that hasn't hit that subscribe button to please hit that big red button? It doesn't cost you anything. It's not really a subscription. It just says that you like videos like this, but it will help me with the algorithm and help these videos to reach more people. Could you also give me a thumbs up? And if you can see it, hit that sort of diamond-shaped hype symbol, because that will promote this video as well. Okay, so let's start with what we know. Earlier this week, a US Air Force C-17 Globemaster flew into Moscow. That aircraft had travelled from the Washington area through Riga in Latvia and then directly into Moscow's airport. We subsequently discovered that CIA Director John Ratcliffe was in Moscow, and we now know exactly who he was meeting. Sergei Naryshkin is the head of Russia's SVR, its Foreign Intelligence Service, so basically the equivalent of the CIA. Naryshkin himself has now confirmed that he sat down face-to-face with John Ratcliffe in Moscow. So effectively, you have the head of the CIA meeting the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. Naryshkin described it as a working-level meeting involving sensitive issues connected with the activities of the two intelligence agencies, but he refused to say exactly what was discussed. And that's obviously quite interesting because publicly both sides are trying to make this sound relatively routine. Donald Trump has described Ratcliffe's trip as semi-routine. Naryshkin is now calling the meeting working level. But this was still the director of the CIA getting onto a US military aircraft, flying secretly into Moscow, sitting down with the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence, and then flying back again a few hours later. And whatever was discussed was subsequently important enough for Vladimir Putin to be briefed on the outcome. So whatever terminology you use, working level, semi-routine, intelligence contacts, this was clearly a very senior conversation. And according to reports from the Wall Street Journal and CBS, one of the messages Ratcliffe apparently delivered was a warning to Russia not to attack NATO members. Neither Washington nor Moscow has officially confirmed that part. In fact, Donald Trump has publicly pushed back against the suggestion that NATO was the purpose of the visit. But multiple US news organisations are now reporting the same story. And that brings us back to the really interesting question. What exactly does American intelligence know that made Washington believe that this conversation needed to take place face-to-face in Moscow? Because the concern appears to be that Russia could potentially attempt something deliberately limited. Something designed not necessarily to start World War III immediately, but to ask a very dangerous question. Would NATO actually respond? Because NATO's entire deterrent rests on Article 5, An attack against one member is supposed to be regarded as an attack against all members. If Estonia is attacked, America is supposed to respond. Britain is supposed to respond, as are France, Germany, Poland, and the rest of NATO. And that promise is enormously powerful. But it only remains powerful for as long as everybody believes it will happen. So imagine hypothetically that Russia doesn't launch a huge conventional invasion. Instead, there's a cyber attack that shuts down critical infrastructure, or unidentified armed personnel cross a border, or drones enter NATO airspace, or there's a small territorial incursion somewhere in the Baltic region. Something confusing, something deniable, something that creates an argument about whether Article 5 actually applies. And what happens then? Does NATO respond militarily? Does America risk escalation with a nuclear power over a relatively small incident? Do all 32 members of NATO agree on what's actually happened? Or do people start arguing? Because if NATO hesitates even once, Russia potentially learns something incredibly valuable. It learns that there are limits. And that appears to be the concern behind this idea of testing NATO. And there have already been incidents which provide some context. Russian drones have entered Romanian airspace. A Russian missile has crossed into Poland. There have also been repeated allegations of sabotage, cyber attacks, and other hybrid activity across Europe. None of those events triggered a NATO war with Russia, but collectively they show just how difficult this grey area can become. And geographically, the Baltic states are particularly sensitive. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are NATO members. They all sit directly alongside Russia and Belarus. And between Belarus and Russian territory of Kaliningrad sits a relatively narrow stretch of territory called the Suwalki Gap. This links Poland with Lithuania and therefore connects the Baltic states by land to the rest of NATO. For years, defence planners have worried about this area because in a serious confrontation, it could become one of the most strategically important pieces of territory in Europe. And remember where Ratcliffe's C-17 stopped before going to Moscow? In Riga, the capital of Latvia. Again, that doesn't prove anything, but it certainly makes the geography of the story interesting. There's also a wider question about timing. Russia has now been fighting the Ukraine war for around 4.5 years. It's suffered enormous casualties and committed huge amounts of equipment and money. But at the same time, the West has also burned through enormous quantities of ammunition and military equipment supporting Ukraine. And now the United States and its allies are also dealing with a war in Iran. That creates another uncomfortable question. Does Russia believe that the West is currently distracted? Does it believe ammunition stockpiles have been depleted? Does it believe political support for NATO is now weak? Does it believe America is overstretched? Because if you were ever going to test an alliance, you'd presumably want to do it at a moment when that alliance was under maximum pressure. And this is where Donald Trump becomes very important. Donald Trump has spent years criticising NATO members for not spending enough on defence. He's repeatedly questioned why America would effectively subsidise the defence of wealthy European countries. And although NATO spending has increased dramatically, Russia may still be interested in discovering exactly how far Donald Trump's commitment to Article 5 goes in practice. That is completely different from launching a full invasion. A full invasion would almost certainly unite NATO immediately. A small, ambiguous incident might do the opposite. And this is why hybrid warfare is potentially so dangerous. The objective isn't necessarily to conquer huge amounts of territory. The objective can simply be to create doubt, because NATO is ultimately built on confidence. If Poland believes America will defend Poland, the deterrent works. If Estonia believes Britain, France, Germany, and America are all going to come to its support, then that system is working fine. But if countries start wondering whether everybody would really turn up when the shooting starts, then the deterrent becomes a lot weaker. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part of this whole story is that we've seen something similar before. In November 2021, the director of the CIA at that time, William Burns, travelled to Moscow. America had intelligence showing that Russia was building up forces around Ukraine. Burns travelled there to deliver a direct warning. The United States essentially told Russia, "We know what you're doing, we can see the preparations, and there will be consequences if you invade Ukraine." Russia denied that it intended to do any sort of thing. A few months later, Russian forces crossed into Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying history is about to repeat itself, the circumstances currently are different. Ukraine was not a NATO member. An attack on NATO territory would carry dramatically greater consequences. And there's no evidence that Russia has actually decided to launch such an attack. But you can understand why a CIA director travelling back to Moscow with another warning is attracting attention, particularly when the last CIA director to make a trip like this was warning Russia about a war that subsequently happened. And Ratcliffe apparently had another message as well. CBS is reporting that Iran was raised during these meetings. Ratcliffe reportedly warned Russian officials that the United States could impose additional sanctions if shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened. That matters because Russia remains closely connected with Iran. Russia and Iran have worked together militarily. Iran supplies Russia with drone technology. Russia has reportedly provided intelligence to assist Iran in its attacks. And now America appears to be using this intelligence back channel with Moscow to talk about both NATO and Iran. So this was potentially a very wide-ranging meeting. You've got Russia, Ukraine, NATO, Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions, military escalation, and the CIA director sitting across the table from the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service in Moscow. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is publicly describing the whole thing as semi-routine. Now, maybe it was. Intelligence agencies maintain communication channels precisely because governments sometimes need to talk privately during periods of extreme tension, and maintaining those channels is generally a good thing. You don't want nuclear powers communicating exclusively through missiles and press conferences. But sending the CIA director himself suggests that Washington wanted this message delivered to a very senior level, and the fact that President Putin was apparently briefed afterwards suggests Moscow understood that too. So I think the really important question isn't whether Russia is about to invade NATO. At the moment, we don't have any evidence at all that it is. The important question is why American intelligence has become sufficiently concerned about Russian intentions that John Ratcliffe was sent personally to Moscow. What have they seen? Is there intelligence about Russian military planning? Is there increased activity around the Baltic states? Is America worried about cyber attacks or sabotage or some sort of hybrid operation? Or is this simply Washington trying to make absolutely certain that Russia understands where the red lines are? Because if it's the latter, then that's reassuring. It means America is trying to prevent escalation. But if US intelligence has identified something specific which triggered this extraordinary trip, then this story could become considerably more important. And that's why I think we need to watch exactly what happens very closely over the next couple of weeks, because the mysterious C-17 has now left Moscow, the CIA director has gone home, Sergei Naryshkin has confirmed the meeting, President Putin knows all about it, the warning has apparently been delivered, and now we wait to see what Russia does. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, or maybe you thought it was just interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if you've got the option of hitting that hype symbol, please do that as well. Thank you so much to everyone that's watching this video all the way through to the end. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your support. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, and particularly thanks to people who've signed up for long-term support through Patreon or YouTube membership. That really keeps me motivated and making as many videos as I can. So I'll see you again next time.